Hey everybody, happy release day. Version 1.14 of Apache NiFi is now out. Bugs have been fixed, features added, and improvements made. I'm Mark Payne, and I'm here to tell you all about it. Now this is a huge release. It's got over 100 bug fixes in it. It's got dozens of improvements, both in terms of performance and usability, and it's got a lot of new features. So I want to take some time to talk about all these new features and some of these improvements that have been added in this version. But I want to start by just saying a big thank you to everybody involved in this release. From the users who are spending time filing bug reports as they run into them, to, of course, the developers who are taking the time to take those bugs and address them and make sure that we have a really high quality product to put out, and to all those people who are spending time just writing documentation so that others are able to use the application more easily. I'm super proud to call myself a part of this team, so thank you all very much for all of the hard work that you've put in. Now, as I said, this is a huge release, so I want to kind of break this apart into a few different sections. And the first section that I want to talk about is essentially the migration guidance, or what you need to know before you start trying to upgrade to version 1.14. So this version of NiFi comes with a couple of gotchas that you need to be aware of. The first and the most obvious one is that whenever you start NiFi, previously everything was insecure by default. So it would run over HTTP on port 8080. In this version, we've actually changed NiFi to be secure by default. So instead of running over HTTP, it's now running over HTTPS. And the default port has changed from port 8080 to port 8443. So now whenever you launch NiFi and you go to HTTPS localhost 8443, it will actually redirect you to this login page. So if you haven't specified a key store and a trust store, NiFi will go ahead and automatically generate one for you whenever you start up. And in order to log in, you need to specify a username and password. So with this, we chose not to use the pattern of using a well-known username and password such as admin, because that doesn't really give us a whole lot of security. Instead, what we've done is that NiFi will automatically generate a username and a password for you when you start up. So if we come over here to the logs, we can scroll up and we'll see that this is the username that was generated for me. And this is the password. So if I specify that, I can go ahead and log in. And we'll see that this user has full permissions to do whatever they want to do. But obviously, it can be a headache to constantly have to look up the username and a password every time that you want to log in. So because of that, there's a new command that we can run. I'll stop NiFi first. And now I can set the username and password to use. Using the set single user credentials command. And then I can give it a username and a password. In this case, I'll use a username of Mark and a password of Mark. And it'll tell me that it's updated my configuration files. I can go ahead and start again. And now if I come over here, I can log out from the user that I was previously using. And when it asks me to log in, I can use a username of Mark and a password of Mark. And it's going to let me log in with all of the permissions that I need. Now it's important to note that this provides the ability to log in as a single user. We have not added any capabilities to add arbitrary users and passwords. And so if you're looking for multi-tenant authorization, we really would recommend that you start looking to using LDAP or OIDC or Kerberos or certificates, SAML, any of those enterprise capabilities that already exist. This is only for a single user. And we've added this as a default in order to prevent the case where users have taken the installation, untarred it, and started running this on AWS or some cloud server or some server that's connected to the internet. We've been seeing that happen quite a bit lately, and that really gives attackers a really easy way to connect to your NiFi instance and have full access to everything if you don't set any sort of username or password or anything. So this gives us the ability to make it really easy to at least start up with a single username and password. And it's also worth noting that if you're running this from a Docker container, there are environment variables now that you can set in order to specify the single user credentials as well. And that information should all be present in the README documentation for the Docker file. And also along those lines is the change that we've made to the sensitive properties key. So previously, if you didn't specify a sensitive properties key, what would happen on startup is that NiFi would go ahead and use a default well-known sensitive properties key. But again, there's a way to improve that by simply using the nifi.sh command, and we can now run set sensitive properties key. And then we can give it the key to use. And of course, we'll want to stop NiFi before we run that command as well. So as soon as we run that command, it's going to look at NiFi properties. It's going to go ahead and decrypt any of those sensitive properties that were already stored. It's then going to re-encrypt them using the newly specified key here, and then write out your flow XML using that newly specified key. And so this just provides a nice convenient way to update that sensitive properties key. And once we've done that, we can go ahead and restart NiFi. Now the only other gotcha that we have in this release that's worth pointing out here is that if we have a simple flow, both of these processors are now valid. If I come in here and update the first processor in the scheduling tab, I can set the execution to primary node, and we can apply that, and that works fine. However, there are a lot of reasons why we wouldn't want to update other processors in our flow to use primary node as the execution mode. And so I actually touched on a lot of these issues that can arise if you do that in my previous video in NiFi Anti-Patterns Part 5. And so because that's become an issue, we've actually gone ahead and updated NiFi in version 1.14 so that if you have execution set to primary node, that actually becomes invalid at this point. So if you have any processor in your flow that has an execution mode of primary node only, that processor cannot have any incoming connections or else it'll be invalid. And I think that about wraps it up for all of the gotchas that we've got in this release. So the next thing that I want to talk about in this release is the merging of a couple of the code bases. Now NiFi has a couple of different sub-projects, NiFi and NiFi Registry. And if you're not familiar with those projects, you can certainly go read up about them and learn more about them. But what we've done in this release is we've taken both of those code bases for NiFi Java and for NiFi Registry, and we've merged them into the NiFi code base. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, I have no idea what you're thinking, but you might be thinking, that's great, but why do I care? How does this affect me? And so one way that it's going to affect you is that NiFi Registry is going to go from version 0.80 to 1.14.0. And NiFi Java is going to go from 0.50 all the way to 1.14.0. Now, the latest release of NiFi Java is actually based on NiFi 1.7.0. And that release is quite old at this point, a few years old. And so by doing this, we're immediately going to rebase everything on 1.14.0. So there's a lot of new features that are being added, a lot of improvements, new processors, new controller services, a lot of bug fixes, all will be put into this next release. But going forward, we're also going to be able to release these more frequently, because each time that there's a release of NiFi, there will be a release of registry and NiFi. And so we'll be able to keep those in sync, and the versions will now be in sync, which makes it a lot easier to understand the feature parity and the compatibility between the different releases. It also means that now that we have a single code base, we can fix bugs, implement new features, and add improvements much more easily and more quickly. For those of you building the data flows, we've got a few new features in this release that'll make your life a little bit easier that we want to talk about. So starting with the ability to download a flow definition has been here for a while. The idea is that once you've created a process group, you can come in here, you can right click on the process group, and you can say, I want to download the flow definition. And that'll go ahead and download it to your local computer. And when we did this, when we added this feature, we always intended to then be able to come in to another NiFi instance and be able to upload that process group and use it in another instance as well. But that's a feature that just hadn't been added yet. And so we finally added that in version 1.14.0. So now whenever I drag a process group onto my canvas, I've got a new icon that I can click here. And from there, I can choose the file I want to upload and click add. And we'll go ahead and add that directly onto my canvas here. So that just makes it a lot easier to share a data flow definition between different instances of NiFi or between different users, instead of having to create a template, go in, save the template off, import the template, instantiate it, delete the template. Now you can just save the process group directly to a file, import it directly from a file, and start using it. The next feature that has been added is an improvement to the record path. For those of you using partition record or some of the other record-oriented processors that make use of the record path, we found that one of the shortcomings was that there are a lot of functions like the isEmpty function that would really come in handy for partitioning or for doing some sort of routing logic and that sort of thing, but they weren't really available as a full record path. They could only be used to filter out whether or not a particular record matches. And so those functions have now become top level functions essentially, so that they can be used in something like partition record. So for example, if I generate some data that looks like this, I might want to partition this data based on whether or not there's a value for the color field. Now, partition record gives us the ability to partition based on what the value of the color field is, but it hasn't ever given us an ability to easily partition on whether or not that color field is defined, because you couldn't use something like isEmpty to check that for partition record. And so with version 1.14.0, we've made all of those types of functions now available for use at the top level. So now I can say I want to partition by not isEmpty /color. So look at the color field at the root of the record and return true if it's not empty, return false if it is empty. And so to test this out, we can actually use another new feature in version 1.14.0, and that's the ability to right click on a processor and say run once. So this is extremely helpful to have as you're developing these flows and trying to iterate over them very quickly, to be able to just trigger a processor to run one time. It's worth noting that if the processor is configured to run on all nodes in your cluster and you say run once, it's going to run one time on each node in the cluster, assuming that it has data or is a source processor. And at that point, we can then use the run once to run partition record one time. And we can see that one flow file came in, two left. So if we list the queue, we can quickly see that there is an attribute called has color. That was the name of the property that I added. This one has a value of true. This one has a value of false. Of course, we can view the data to verify that. In this case, all three of the records have a color field. And in this case, none of the records will have a value for the color field. They all have a value of null. And for those of you responsible for operating NiFi instances, we've got some goodies for you in this release too. So first of all, if you right click on a process group and you choose to start or stop, that's going to start or stop all of the processors in that process group. But what we found is that typically people expect that to start and stop any of these remote process groups that they have within that group as well. Previously, it did not do that. It only took care of the processors. But in 1.14, we've updated that so that now anytime that you choose to start or stop a process group, that takes the remote process groups into account as well. So as you can see, we've now started it. We can come over here and say stop. You see that it's no longer running. We can start it again. And this operates on all of the processors as well as the remote process groups. And speaking of remote process groups, we've made a performance improvement here, which depending on how you're using it may be pretty slight or it may be pretty massive. So if you're using site-to-site to send larger flow files, this performance improvement isn't going to be that dramatic for you. But if you're using site-to-site to send or receive a really large volume of tiny flow files, the performance improvement is pretty huge. So I did some tests that would send a lot of tiny flow files from one node to another on a very fast, low latency network, and I saw about a 50% improvement in performance. When I then ran the same test, but across a network that had a long latency, meaning about 70 milliseconds or so to perform a ping, so 70 milliseconds round trip time, we saw performance closer to 400% better throughput. So that's a pretty significant improvement there for any time that you're sending a large volume of small flow files. The next improvement that I want to highlight here is that if we come over here and look at the status history on a connection, there are a couple of new metrics listed here now. Total queue duration, max queue duration, and average queue duration. So this is going to tell us how long these flow files are actually sitting in this particular queue. So if you're trying to find out where the data is actually sitting throughout the system, where latency is occurring and that sort of thing, this can be a really big help to try and diagnose and really to just understand how data is flowing through your system. And one thing that's really cool about the status history in this version is that you can now actually change it to be persisted. So all of these metrics that are shown here can now be persisted across restarts. Now there's a bit of a gotcha there in that by default that doesn't happen. So to enable that, we have to actually update our NiFi.properties. So if we come in here and we search for status, we'll see that by default, the implementation is the volatile component status repository. If you want that to be persisted across restarts, you have to change that to the embedded quest DB status history repository. And don't worry, these values are actually listed in the administrator's guide, so you don't have to try to remember that huge word there, that huge class name. Now, we did not make this the default yet, just because it's a very new implementation and it's going to require a bit of disk space be used to actually store all of these metrics. And by default, those metrics are going to be stored in the NiFi home directory. So we didn't want to spring all of that on new unsuspecting users. So for now, we've gone ahead and left the previous existing implementation as the default. And it's up to you to decide whether or not you want to go ahead and opt in to the new persisted implementation. I suspect that in the future we will go ahead and update this to be the default, but for now you need to opt in. And also of note, this is a new feature that was added in 1.13, but if you missed it, we've now got in our hamburger menu here a new node status history. So just like we have all of the different stats that you can see for different processors and connections and that sort of thing, this is actually now going to record system level stats. So we can choose from this drop down that we want to look at things like open file handles or processor load average, heap utilization, all sorts of really helpful system level metrics that we can look at here. And again, this is going to be persisted across restarts. And then there's one other interesting new feature that we've added here that I want to highlight. So go ahead and stop this. And that is the ability to decommission a node. So to demonstrate how this works, I just want to generate some random data here. I'll say that I want to generate some 1 megabyte flow files. And in that amount of time, we've generated 1.4 gigabytes. And if we list the queue, we can see that that's pretty well spread across the different nodes. So localhost 8481, localhost 8482, and you'll see that alternating in the queue, showing that there's data on both nodes. And what I can now do, if I decide that I no longer need one of my nodes, I can actually run nifi.sh decommission. And what that's going to do is it's going to go ahead and stop everything that's running on node 2. It's going to disconnect node 2 from the cluster. It's going to then offload all of the data from node 2 to the rest of the nodes in the cluster. And then it's going to shut down node 2 and remove it entirely from the cluster. So it completely eliminates itself from the cluster. It shuts down the NiFi instance, and you can see here that we still have the 1.43 gigabytes of data that was generated. All of that is now going to reside on node 1. So if we list the queue, we can see which node it's on. It's all on the same node now, but we make sure that it's distributing that data across the entire cluster and handles all of the cluster disconnection and removal logic for you to ensure that there's no data loss, but you're still able to take that node out of the cluster completely. So I think that covers all of the highlights that I really wanted to talk about in this release. This is certainly not all of the improvements and new features that we've got in this release, but it's the ones that I felt were the most exciting for me personally. There's a lot more out there. Certainly, I would encourage you to go check out the full release notes and look through the JIRAs to understand exactly what went into this release. Thanks for taking the time to watch. Please like, share, subscribe, and all that good stuff. Thanks. Take care.